The rain hammered the avenue. Not that cinematic rain that washes everything clean. This was slushy, gray, visceral. Low-hanging clouds hovered over the restaurant's facade as if the sky itself wanted a front-row seat to what was happening down below. Richard Bennett gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His gold wedding band, the one that cost more than a starter home in the suburbs, caught the intermittent flash of the traffic lights. Inside the car, everything smelled of fresh leather and freezing air conditioning. Outside, reality threw itself against the glass like a silent scream. He saw the silhouette first. Two people crouched under the restaurant's awning, the very place he dined the night before with the company's board of directors. The two bodies huddled against the downpour, sharing something he couldn't quite make out. Richard pressed his face closer to the fogged-up glass. His heart started pounding in a rhythm his private concierge doctor hadn't been able to regulate. It was his parents. His mother was eating voraciously from an old takeout container, one of those beat-up aluminum trays. His father was shielding the food with his own body, as if someone might snatch that single meal away from them. The rain splattered onto his shoulders, running down the spine that protruded sharply beneath his thin shirt. And that face, God, that face that had rocked him to sleep as a child, was drawn, consumed, unrecognizable from hunger. Richard killed the engine with a gesture that felt violent. The silence was absolute. Just the sound of the rain intensifying, hammering the glass as if demanding permission to enter. He opened the door. The cold hit him first, then the humidity, which always felt like a personal insult. This was the kind of weather his climate-controlled mansion didn't allow his body to know. He crossed the sidewalk in quick strides, and every step was a denial. Denial of what he was seeing. Denial of what he was incapable of comprehending. His mother looked up first. Recognition washed over her face like a wave, but it was immediately replaced by something worse. Shame. That primal shame, like a creature discovered in its most humiliating hiding place. She tried to cover the aluminum tray with her arms, skinny as they were, as if she could simply erase the evidence of that reality. His father didn't move immediately. He stayed crouched, eyes fixed on the food, as if staying still could scare Richard away or turn him into an illusion. "What are you two doing here?" Richard's voice sounded strange in his own ears. Cold, controlled, like it was coming from an automated machine. It conveyed none of the horror his mind was processing. His mother took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was a raspy whisper. "It's none of your business, son. Go away." His father finally stood up, moving with the slowness of someone carrying too much weight in their bones. His white hair was soaked through, plastered to his skull like a second skin. His eyes met Richard's for a split second, and in that instant, Richard understood something words could never reach. His father would rather die on these streets than be seen like this by his son. But Richard didn't let the silence take over. He insisted, with the coldness of someone who still believed money was a language everyone spoke. "Come with me, now." His mother shook her head, a barely perceptible gesture. She looked at the takeout tray, then at her son's face, that boy who had been born in a drafty wooden shack, and chose refusal. Wounded pride is a chain heavier than any necessity. Richard took a deep breath, inhaling the damp, exhaust-filled air. He looked at them for a few more seconds, as if visual insistence could rewrite the moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the car. Every step was a defeat. Richard's mind was a living archive of memories he'd paid a fortune in therapy to learn how to manage. 25 years ago, in that tenement with the dirt floor on the south side of Chicago, his father used to wake up before dawn. Richard remembered the sound, the distinct sound of his father lacing up his work boots, those worn-out construction boots that left a bitter smell of dry sweat and drywall dust. His father would whisper a prayer to St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, as he walked down the stairs made of reclaimed wood and rusted nails. And his mother? She organized other people's laundry into plastic bags, silent tears rolling down her face while her swollen fingers smoothed fabrics she could never own. Those fingers that fed him at night, scraping a little of her food onto his plate. Richard had pretended not to notice for years. The promise had been made on a specific night. Richard was 13. His father had come home with a fractured rib, an accident on the construction site, no insurance, no workers' comp. Just a broken rib and his weekly wages canceled. Richard saw his father lying on the bed, breathing with difficulty, and heard his mother whispering, "I don't know how I'm going to buy groceries this month." It was that night that Richard placed his hand over his father's hand and made a promise. "One day I'm going to get you out of here. You're never going to suffer like this again." His father had squeezed his hand with that grip that meant everything. Hope, blind faith in a son, and the resignation of someone who knows this promise is the only gift they can offer. That night, Richard walked into his penthouse and closed the door as if he were sealing a bunker. The kitchen was Italian marble and stainless steel. Every utensil had been chosen by an interior designer. Modern pendant lights hung like jewels, casting a white artificial light that killed any shadow, any nuance, anything that looked real. Richard walked to the fridge, that combo refrigerator freezer that cost more than his father's annual salary, and opened it. It was stocked with food that would rot without ever being touched. He sat in the glass and metal armchair in the living room. Surrounding him were floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city sleeping down below, those buildings nestled one on top of the other. Somewhere in that maze, his parents were sleeping. Where? Under which awning? On which wet street corner? Under which roof where they didn't pay rent? Richard opened his laptop. The numbers appeared on the screen like a code that was supposed to explain everything. Bank statements from the last 2 years. Every month, like clockwork, Richard had transferred $5,000 to his parents' account. 5,000. That should have been abundance for anyone coming from where they came from. But those numbers had an alternate history nobody had told Richard. Every transfer was there, untouched. The last 20 deposits. None had been withdrawn. None had moved the account. The balance had grown month by month, an accumulation of cash his son sent like someone tossing coins into a well, hoping the wish comes true. Richard closed the laptop. Slowly. Deliberately. Like someone pulling a silk handkerchief off a magic trick, revealing there is no rabbit underneath. His parents weren't just in need. They were hiding. From the money, from themselves, from the evidence that their son had failed to keep the promise he'd made with his warm hand squeezed in theirs. And in all that freezing mansion, in that luxury refuge he'd built with the sweat of his brow, Richard finally understood that he had left that tenement, but he had never really brought his parents with him. The rain kept falling outside. There is something revolting about watching someone be treated this way, isn't there? Not by the indifference of the world, but by the indifference of those who should love them the most. If you also believe that emotional justice must be served, that negligence, even when plated in gold, must be confronted, hit that like button right now to support Richard on this journey of rediscovering what it really means to care. Richard arrived at the bungalow on Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't really a shack, it was a modest house painted light blue with a small front garden where his mother had planted begonias years ago. Richard had bought the property 3 years prior, paid in cash without telling his parents he'd done it. He simply handed them the keys and said, "It's yours now, no rent, no worries." That house had cost $250,000. To his parents, it should have been a palace, but a palace bought with silence, without presence, without visits, without the son showing up at the door to share that space. That wasn't a gift. It was a gilded cage disguised as benevolence. He parked the car, that Mercedes that shined even under the overcast sun, and took a deep breath. His hands were still trembling. The image of the old takeout tray fed by the rain had taken up permanent residence in his mind, a specter that flashed every time he closed his eyes. The door opened before he could ring the bell. His mother was there, wrapped in a faded white apron that had probably belonged to 5 generations of women. Her gray hair was pinned up in a messy bun. Her eyes, those eyes that had taught him to love before he learned to speak, welled up with water upon recognizing her son. Richard. My God. She didn't hug him. She just stood there blocking the entrance, as if her body were a wooden gate that could be bolted shut at any moment. "Hi, Mom. Where's Dad?" "Resting. He's not feeling well." Richard walked in uninvited. The interior of the house was immaculate. Not a speck of dust. The furniture, old, second-hand, bought at community thrift stores, was arranged with military precision. The living room smelled of cleaning products, wood wax, that aroma of a life insisting on dignity even when no one is watching. His father emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, walking slowly. He had aged more than Richard had allowed his brain to register. His body was a sketch of the man who had raised buildings with his bare hands. His eyes, however, kept that fire, that quality of someone who has seen so much that nothing can truly surprise him anymore. Son. Just that. Just the absolute acknowledgement of a presence that was anything but constant. Richard went straight to the point. He had rehearsed it mentally during the entire drive over, but the words came out sounding corporate, like he was pitching a project to investors. "You two can't go on like this. I want to move you to a better apartment. I'm thinking about a condo downtown, somewhere secure, close to good doctors. Or, if you prefer, we can travel. You always wanted to see Europe. My assistant is already researching packages." "Richard." His father's voice was a knife cutting through any illusion. "We don't want money. We want a son." The silence that followed those words was the kind of silence that occupies physical space. It was heavy, hot, suffocating. His mother had sat down in a worn armchair, her hands trembling in her lap. Richard felt his face burning. That sensation that went back to adolescence, the feeling of being judged and found lacking. "Dad, you don't understand. I work. My responsibilities aren't simple. I have 400 employees depending on the decisions I make, investors who trust me. It's not like I can just disappear." "Nobody is asking you to disappear, Richard." Now it was his mother speaking. Her voice was almost inaudible, but every word was precise, sharp. "We are asking you to appear." He left the house 20 minutes later, feeling like he had failed a test he didn't know he was taking. His car had never felt so empty as he drove through the streets of the city, the traffic lights blinking red like accusations. That night, Richard did what he does when he can't solve something through conversation. He paid. He hired a cook, a competent middle-aged woman who had worked for executives, and he hired a private nurse, experienced in geriatric care, with impeccable references. These were people who could offer what he couldn't: daily presence, conversation, attention. It was an elegant solution, mathematical, justifiable. The next day, he got a call from the cook. "Mr. Bennett, your parents politely declined my services. They wouldn't let me in the house." Richard took a deep breath. "And the nurse?" "Same thing. Your mother said they didn't need special care, that if God wanted to take them, they'd go together without strangers in the house." He hung up the phone and stood motionless for a few minutes. Rejection was the same thing as having a door slammed in your face repeatedly, until you finally understand that the door was never meant to open for you. 2 days later, Richard called his mother. There was something he needed her to sign, a document related to inheritance, property distribution. It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. His mother picked up on the third ring. She was talking to a friend, her voice low, confidential, that tone women use when sharing the secrets that destroy them. No, he doesn't know about that. God help me, he can never know." Richard froze. "I should have told him when he was young. But how do you tell a child something like that? How do you look in your son's eyes and confess that you were so weak?" There were sobs now. The sound of a woman who had spent 40 years of life guarding something she could no longer carry alone. "It's my fault, Nancy. If I hadn't hidden that from him as a child, maybe he'd understand. Maybe he wouldn't be this cold man, so lost, so empty." Richard heard his mother breathe deeply, as if realizing she had said too much. There was a pause. Then, "I'm sorry, dear. Forget I said that." The call continued for a few more minutes, about the inheritance document, about his father's health, about mundane things that served only to fill the space where the truth had been born and died. When Richard hung up, he remained in the dark of his office, that room all glass and steel, staring at the city down below. And for the first time in many years, he realized he didn't know who he was. There was something his parents had hidden from him, something so important that his mother had spent a lifetime carrying the weight. And in that moment, Richard understood that maybe his failure to reach his parents wasn't about money, about presents, or about promises made in adolescence. Maybe it was about secrets, about the truth that had been deliberately kept at a distance, and the truth always finds a way back to the surface. Always. Like blood from a nosebleed you try to hide, but eventually, inevitably, it shows up on your lips. The cookout was happening on a sunny Saturday at Cousin Mark's house, that cousin who had inherited a trucking business from his dad, and lived showing it off as if it were a personal achievement. The house was big, but not as big as Richard's. This mattered to Mark in a way Richard had learned to recognize: envy masked as cordiality. Richard arrived with 2 gifts: a Swiss watch for his father, the kind of watch you don't consult to check the time, but to communicate to the world that you can afford to measure time in gold, and a sapphire necklace for his mother, wrapped in a leather box made to order. Together, the gifts cost more than most of the cars in Mark's driveway. When he entered the backyard, his parents were already there. His mother was wearing a dress Richard recognized as the same one she had worn to a baptism 5 years ago. His father wore a dress shirt, starched with precision, but still that shirt looked uncomfortable on a man who had spent his life in work clothes. His eyes met Richard's. There was no joy in that meeting. There was only mutual recognition of a social obligation. The atmosphere of the cookout was that type of awkwardness only family can produce. The aunts whispered when Richard walked by. The cousins offered handshakes that were more corporate transactions than gestures of affection. Mark positioned him as if he were a conquered trophy. Here comes my cousin, the successful executive, while winking at his smartphone camera, always documenting, always performing. Richard stayed on the sidelines, his white linen suit contrasting with the shorts and t-shirts of the other men. He was a note out of key in his own family event. When the moment for speeches came, and there was always a moment for speeches at these events, Richard had learned, he asked for attention. His heart was racing. He had mentally rehearsed these words that were supposed to bring his parents back into his world. I wanted everyone to understand something important. My parents, those 2 people right there, were the architects of everything I am. Sacrifice, dedication, unconditional love. There is no company I could have built, no success I could have achieved without the foundation they gave me. Therefore, I would like to honor them publicly with these small tokens of gratitude. It was at that moment that Uncle Gus, a middle-aged man with a face red from beer and resentment, stood up. You think gifts buy back lost time, huh? Gifts? Richard, where were you when your father needed you? Where were you when your mother was sick? Do you know how many times I brought your father to my house so he could eat properly? How many times your mother left here with leftovers in her purse because she was too ashamed to ask her own son for help? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that flows like frozen lava. Every eye turned to Richard. His mother had lowered her head. His father simply looked at the grass as if finding all the answers he needed there. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but there were no words. There were no answers that could be given out loud, in public, under the scrutiny of people who had already decided on a narrative about who he was. Uncle, you don't understand the situation, Richard began. I understand perfectly. You're a rich man who neglected his parents. End of story. Mark remained seated, and something about his silence, that lack of defense for his cousin, that strategic abstention, revealed that he had planted that mine, had let that information reach Uncle Gus's ears. Envy had finally found its instrument of destruction. Richard placed the gifts on the table and left the cookout 20 minutes later. He drove in silence, his palms sweating on the steering wheel. Humiliation was not an emotion he had developed tools to process. The video popped up on Instagram that Sunday. Someone had filmed it with a smartphone. that dishonest angle that captures only the essential, removing context, nuance, anything that approached the truth. There was Richard's furious face. There was Uncle Gus pointing at him. And there was a caption added in the edit. Millionaire shames poor family at party. Video shocks social media. 14,000 views in 6 hours. The comments started multiplying like bacteria. People who didn't know Richard, who had never done a single act of charity in their lives, became experts on his lack of humanity. There were articles from small blogs, those media outlets that live off scandal. There was coverage from local influencers who saw in that story the perfect opportunity for engagement. "Meet the dark side of the city's richest man," screamed a headline. "Fake philanthropy. How millionaires pretend to be good," screamed another. Richard had spent the last 5 years building an image. He had donated to orphanages. He had sponsored education programs in the inner city. He had appeared in magazines as the man of the future, the conscientious executive who proves capitalism can have a heart. All of that collapsed in 48 hours. His cell phone rang non-stop. His lawyers wanted an answer. His partners wanted an explanation. Public opinion, that mass that had never truly known him, decided he was a villain. And villains on the internet don't deserve compassion. They deserve destruction. Richard stayed in his mansion, that refuge of glass and steel, watching the city turn against him through the screens of his multiple monitors. He had tried to do the right thing. He had tried to redeem himself. And all he had managed to do was worsen a situation that was already impossible. There was a quality of injustice in this that consumed him. It wasn't fair. He hadn't done anything the video suggested. He had cared within his limitations. He had sent money. He had bought the house he had planned, and all the planning had failed because his parents didn't want money. They wanted something that was beyond his power to offer. That was when the phone rang at 2 in the morning. His father's voice on the other end of the line was everything Richard had never prepared himself to hear. It was broken. It was old. It was like hearing an instrument that had been tuned for a lifetime finally go out of key. "Richard, your mother, she's in the hospital. Pneumonia. The doctors are taking care of her." Richard jumped out of bed. I'm coming right now." "Which hospital?" No." The word came out like a sentence. "Please don't come. She doesn't want to see you. Your name is in all the papers. She's weak, Richard. She doesn't need that pain right now. She needs peace." "Dad, I'm your son. I need to be there." "You should have thought of that before." His father hung up. Richard stood in the silence of his mansion, that glass structure he had believed would protect him. And for the first time in many years, he understood that he had lost. Not only had he failed to save his parents, he had failed to safeguard the most fundamental right a son should have, the right to be present when everything falls apart. His mother was admitted. His parents hated him. The entire city had decided he was a villain, and he was more alone in his palace than his parents were in that hospital, facing death side by side. Richard parked the car a block away from the hospital. He didn't want to be seen, tracked, documented by security cameras that would be present in any public place at that moment, when his face was synonymous with disgrace. He went through the emergency door disguised in that way rich men learn to do when they want to be invisible. A baseball cap, dark sunglasses, a gray jacket that could belong to anyone. The third-floor corridor smelled of disinfectant and impending death. That hospital aroma that penetrates fabrics that you carry with you for hours after leaving the place. Richard walked slowly, as if the movement needed to be justified. A nurse passed by him without looking. A doctor consulted a tablet while walking. No one recognized him. His father was sitting outside his mother's room, in a gray plastic chair that seemed designed to cause maximum discomfort. He was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, his head tilted back, his breathing shallow. Richard watched that face for a few seconds. It had been months since he had seen him at peace, since he had seen that face without the contraction of hurt, without the rigidity of resentment. Richard entered the room. His mother was connected to several tubes, an oxygen tube under her nose, an IV catheter in her left hand, a machine beside the bed that registered her heart in neon green peaks. Her eyes were closed, but she wasn't completely asleep. It was that state between wakefulness and sleep where the mind can't establish boundaries between the real and the dreamlike. Richard approached slowly, pulled up a chair, sat down. His mother opened her eyes. For a moment, there was confusion on her face. Her myopic eyes tracked the movements without registering who that man before her was. Then something in her brain reorganized. But it didn't reorganize for Richard. It reorganized for a young version of her husband. "You came back," she whispered, her voice raspy, almost inaudible. Richard didn't answer. He just let her continue in her delusion. Was it cruelty? Yes. But it was also the only way to get to the truth. His mother reached out her hand, that hand that had fed generations, that had washed other people's clothes, that had placed cold compresses on fevers when there was no money for doctors, and placed it on his arm. "I always wanted to tell him, you know that. But you said no, that it was better, that he could never know that he wasn't—" Richard froze. "That he wasn't what?" Richard asked, his voice deliberately low, deep, imitating the deepest tones he could manage. "That he wasn't our blood. That we found him, that baby in the doorway of that construction site, that boy crying. God, how he cried. Do you remember? You said maybe it was a sign, that maybe God was giving us a second chance." Tears began to run down Richard's mother's face. Her hands were trembling. "I was 53, you were 57. We were too poor, too stupid. But that boy saved us. It wasn't us who saved him. It was him who saved us." Richard sat completely still. The world had stopped, or it had kept spinning, but he had been removed from its rotation, suspended in a vacuum where the laws of physics worked differently. "Why didn't you ever tell him?" Richard asked, his voice still deep, still pretending to be his father. "Because he was good. He was so good, and we wanted him to fly high, not to feel like he was tied to us, to believe he had the right to be more than us, to dream more than us." His mother closed her eyes. "When he grew up, he got so busy, so far away, and we pulled away, so he wouldn't feel guilty, so he would believe he had chosen his life, not that he was stuck with ours." Richard stood up slowly. He left the room. His father was still sleeping in the chair. He drove on autopilot. He didn't remember leaving the hospital, getting to the car, driving through the city streets. He just suddenly found himself at his parents' house, that light blue structure with the begonias in the garden he had bought 3 years ago. The door was unlocked. His parents never locked the door, not even after he sent enough money for security systems. Their trust in the universe was something Richard had never learned to replicate. The chest was in the bedroom. Richard knew it because he had seen it once, years ago, when he still visited with some regularity. That dark wooden chest that had belonged to his father's grandfather, that had survived 2 generations of poverty only because it was so ugly nobody wanted to steal it. He opened it. The birth certificate was in a paper envelope. Richard Souza Bennett. Date of birth, August 3rd, 1987. Parentage, unknown. The word unknown had been typed, and a later hand had manually added in red ink the names of his parents as legal guardians. There were letters underneath. Yellowed letters, thin paper, envelopes that had been opened and reread so many times the folds had turned into scars. The first was from 1987, written in handwriting Richard recognized as his mother's, firmer back then, but still the same person. "My dear Richard, you are the most beautiful baby I have ever seen. You were crying when you arrived, but now you sleep with your mouth open, so confident, so sure that you are safe. What a privilege to be the woman who puts you to sleep. Your father is in the doorway right now, just looking at you, tears in his eyes. He has never cried before. You have already changed us, and only a few hours have passed. We promised something to the God you deserve to believe in. We promised that you would never know you were left, that you would grow up believing you were loved from the first moment, that you were wanted, that you were chosen, because you were chosen. By God or by life or by whatever force put you in our hands, you were chosen. We are poor, but you won't be. You can't be. Because we are going to work until our hands bleed, until our bones break, until the last cent of this life, so that you can fly higher than we could ever reach. But Richard, there is one thing you need to know. Even if you fly so high you can't see us down here anymore, we will be here. Always here. Looking up, with aching necks, cheering for you to find the sky. With all the love of a mother who chose you the second you arrived, your mom. Richard held the letter, the whole letter, as if the paper were too fragile to be unfolded again. There were other letters. Letters from when he was 10. Letters from when he was 20. Unsent letters, because how do you send a letter that recontextualizes an entire life? How do you explain to a son that his whole life was a lie built with love? There was a photo too. Richard as a toddler, maybe 2 years old, in his father's arms. Both are smiling. His father looks at the camera with an expression Richard had never seen on his face before. That expression is ownership. That expression is, "This boy is mine." Richard held the photo and the false certificate in the same hand. The paper of the certificate felt warm, as if it were alive. He understood everything in that moment. The distancing hadn't been rejection. It was protection. It was his parents deliberately removing themselves from his life so he wouldn't feel tied to them, tied to their poverty, tied to the origin they feared would contaminate him. That love had taken the shape of abandonment because it was the only form they knew of offering freedom, and he had fully, completely failed to understand that. The takeout tray in the rain wasn't about financial need. It was about orphans, his parents feeling like orphans of their own son. It was about the loneliness of loving someone so much you have to pretend you don't love them to allow them to be free. Richard stayed there, sitting on the floor of his parents' bedroom, holding the certificate that denied his origin, the photo that confirmed his belonging, and the letter that explained everything that had gone wrong. And in that moment, as the late afternoon light passed through the window, Richard understood he wasn't an abandoned man. He was a man loved too much. So completely, so deeply, that his parents had sacrificed the right to be loved in return to allow him to believe in his own right to fly. He was furious, hurt, broken, but he was also absolutely crystal clear and determined about what he needed to do. The hospital room was silent that morning, that silence that only exists when death has already stopped by and decided to come back later. His mother was sleeping, her face finally peaceful, the machines beside her marking the rhythm of life in green numbers. His father was awake, sitting in that damn gray chair, looking out the window at the city down below. That same city that had turned his son into a villain 24 hours ago. Richard entered slowly, closed the door behind him. His father didn't turn around. "Dad." The word came out like a test, as if Richard were testing if he still had the right to use it. His father turned. There was something different in his look now. It wasn't anger, it was something heavier. It was disappointment tempered with resignation. Richard held out the certificate. The yellowed paper, that proof that he hadn't come from his mother's body, that he had been left in a doorway, that he had been chosen. "I know," Richard said. "I know everything." His father stood up slowly, took the paper from Richard's hands, looked at him as if seeing the face of a man he had raised, and understanding for the first time that he had raised him well. "This here doesn't change anything," Richard continued, his voice broken in a way he rarely allowed anyone to hear. "You chose to be my parents. I need to choose to be your son, again. Let me." His father hugged Richard in a way only fathers can. Not a hug of comfort, but a hug of recognition. Of a man finally admitting he had been right in all his silent choices. No words were spoken. No words were necessary. 3 days later, Richard summoned the press to the main plaza of the city. The reporters came. They came because there was blood in the water, the possibility of a retraction, a confession, maybe even a media suicide. They came because the narrative they had woven was finally reaching its dramatic peak. There was a simple stage, just a wooden platform with a podium. No luxury, no big production. Richard wanted it to be as simple as possible, because what was going to happen on that stage wasn't about staging. It was about truth. His parents went up first. His mother, who still coughed occasionally, her lungs still recovering from that pneumonia that had actually been a coded message that she was tired of carrying the weight of distance alone. His father, that man who had carried buildings with his bare hands, now carrying only dignity. They were dressed up. His mother wore a new dress, the one Richard had bought, but she had insisted on wearing only that day. His father wore that suit he had kept stored for 40 years for weddings and funerals. But clearly, obviously, they were simple people. There was no amount of money that could disguise their origin, and Richard hadn't tried. He positioned himself a step behind them, and then he began to tell a story. 39 years ago, a man and a woman found a baby. He had been left in the doorway of a construction site where that man worked as a bricklayer. The woman was a washerwoman. They were poor. So poor there were days they split one meal. So poor they slept in a single room. So poor any rational person would have told that man, "Walk away, leave that baby for the state. You can't take care of yourself. How are you going to take care of a child?" Richard paused, looked at his parents. But they weren't rational people. They were people with hearts that didn't know calculus. That man took that baby in his arms and said to his wife, "This boy is ours now." And from that day on, every sacrifice, every drop of sweat, every shared meal, every sleepless night was a choice. A choice made every day for 40 years. Richard took a deep breath. That bricklayer worked until his bones became brittle. That washerwoman scrubbed other people's clothes until her hands bled. And they did it because they loved that baby. Not because they were obligated, because they chose to. Because they understood that love isn't a feeling you feel. It's an action you take. The crowd had gone silent. Even the journalists had lowered their phones slightly. For years I believed I had failed them, that I had done everything wrong, that my success was a rejection of their sacrifice. But the truth is simpler. They gave me the freedom to fly high, and then stayed down here, looking at the sky, necks aching, rooting for me. Because that is the job of being a parent. It's not being perfect. It's loving so completely that you remove yourself from the path to allow the one you love to become bigger than you ever were. Richard paused again. His voice, when it returned, was steadier. Starting today, the Richard Bennett Foundation for Social Development is being renamed the Joe and Mary Bennett Foundation, to honor the two names my parents chose for themselves every day of their lives. And the first project this foundation will fund is a community kitchen in every neighborhood of the city, a place where nobody will eat luxury leftovers, where every elderly person will have a place of honor, where the food is made with love, by people who understand that feeding someone is a sacred act. Richard reached out his hands to his parents, pulled them forward. The stage had been theirs the whole time. He had just been saving the spot. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then like a roar. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but nobody was really listening. Everyone was looking at the face of a simple man, a retired bricklayer, tears streaming down as the city that had judged him now revered him. And at the woman beside him, that washerwoman whose expression was of a pride so immense it transcended any standard human emotion. That was the look of a mother who finally, after 40 years, had been recognized. 6 months later, Richard's parents' house had been renovated, but not destroyed. It had kept its simple essence. Just new floors, a modernized kitchen, a bathroom that finally had hot water. But it was still that same light blue house, with the begonias in the garden that his mother tended to every day. That night they were having dinner together. Richard, his parents, and nothing else. The food was simple. Rice, beans, a stew made by his mother that had taken 6 hours to prepare. There was nothing fancy about it, but there was something five-star cuisine could never replicate. There was love in every spoonful. Richard helped clear the table, walked to the sink, started washing the dishes while his mother dried them. His father, sitting on a kitchen chair, told old stories. Those stories storytellers tell when they finally understand they are alive and there is time. And in that moment, with his hands in the hot, soapy water, Richard understood a truth no amount of money could have ever taught. Wealth wasn't in that glass and steel mansion. It wasn't in the monthly transfers. It wasn't in the Swiss watch or the sapphire necklace. Wealth was this. Wealth was an ordinary night in an ordinary kitchen, doing an ordinary task, while people you love are close enough for you to hear them breathe. His mother put her hand on his shoulder while he washed. Didn't say anything, just left it there, that hand that had done everything. And Richard understood that touch was a language he hadn't learned from formal education or company executives. It was the language his parents had spoken since day one. The language of choice, of presence, of love that asks nothing in return other than to be there. True justice, Richard finally understood, wasn't public retraction or foundations with his name in gold letters. True justice was simple. It was being home. It was choosing to be here every day for the rest of his life, washing dishes, listening to stories, being a son in a way he had ignored when he had the option to be a millionaire. Because being a millionaire was easy. Anyone can work for money. But being a son, that was a choice that had to be made every day, every damn night, forever. And that night, Richard finally started to learn. Did you catch that? The injustice wasn't financial. It was emotional. A father and mother who sacrificed everything and still felt alone. If you felt angry seeing Richard's parents eating under an awning in the rain, if you felt someone should have done more, hit that like button right now to support not just Richard, but all those parents out there, alone, waiting for their children to finally understand that presence is more valuable than any treasure. This story taught us that true love isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in choices. In every day you choose to be present. In every night you sit beside someone you love. In every ordinary moment you turn into something sacred, simply because you are there, completely, without distractions. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that remind us of what truly matters, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because here we tell stories about people who choose to love. And that always, always pays off.